practicing, workshopping. I'm happy to kind of circle around and give input for anybody who's feeling stuck. And again, a lot of this is in the spirit of asking questions in the way that we're going to talk about asking questions today, approaching customers in a way that's not selling. It's really after discovering new and interesting insights is a difficult thing. And again, for those of you who have done it, and all of you should have, I'm not Mark, so I won't come up here and like make you, if you said you didn't do it, make you sit down or something. That's not really my jam. But next week, be ready for that, right? But it's one of those things that takes some practice. And so what I'm hoping we can do, again, is talk about what worked well and what didn't in that last part, get some insight from each other, some insight from me, and see when you go back out there to interview customers, again, if you can be that much more effective. So I'm Professor Andrew Earle. I teach in the management department at the Paul College. And probably most relevant to what we're doing today is I also do a lot of field research. Field research involves going out and talking to people, trying to understand what they're doing and why, trying to uncover different processes, specifically around technology commercialization. So everything from topic to technique that we're going to talk about today is something that I'm passionate about. And I also know firsthand how hard it is because I've screwed it up many times. For those of you who have been through I-Corps before, I see a couple familiar faces. You'll hear a couple of anecdotes and stories that I know you've heard before, but I still think that they're good illustrative stories about when this can go right, and almost more importantly, when this can go wrong. So I have some detailed things here from Beth. Let me see. All of it's important, Beth, if you're listening, but I'm going to skip over some of it.
It's fine. I'm here.
That's okay. Yeah, I guess the most important ones are, let's see, remind teams, email preference about rescheduling the next meeting with Beth no later than 10 a.m. tomorrow. Choices are Tuesday, October 8th from 2 to 4. Anyways, Beth, can you maybe send that in an email rather than me reading it?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So announcements on those meetings will be made no later than Friday. I think the big point is we just want to get up and get going with those meetings. So, so here we go. So our task today is to learn about this thing we call talking to humans. And again, we actually use that title intentionally because it's provocative, because we talk to humans all the time, right? For those of us on the faculty, it's part of our job. And I haven't issued grades yet, so I won't ask my students whether or not I'm effective at it. I try hard. I hope that I'm effective at least some of the times. But it turns out it's kind of a tricky thing to do. And again, it's a tricky thing to do because we want to not just talk to humans in general, but we want to actually talk to customers. And not talk to customers in general, but we want to get insights into why the customers do what they do. And that's actually kind of a tricky thing, right? I think if you think back through what you do in a normal day, but those questions is simple, but it's actually surprisingly hard to answer. Why do you do what you do? Well, it actually takes some thought. And so sometimes people are guarded about why they do what they do. Maybe it's a trade secret or a source of competitive advantage. But other times that's just the way we've done things. Or maybe that's the way that our industry is regulated. Maybe that's the norms in our field, right? So those are the kind of things that we're trying to uncover. I'm going to motivate it a little bit with why bother doing it. Again, sometimes the knee-jerk reaction to this is I already know how to do it. Why are we having a class on it? But again, even if you're good at this, you can always get better. And arguably, too, again, the specific way we're going to talk about doing this kind of research is probably different than any of you've done before, especially if you haven't gone through I-Corps or another lean startup-based training. Talk a little bit about some secrets to get in the door, and then I want to hear about who you talked to and what did you learn. Not in a way that I want to sort of critique it at all. I just really want us to be able to share and learn from one another. Again, when you go out and do this, a lot of times you uncover things, again, little ways to go about either sort of getting those intros that you need to actually be able to talk to somebody, or when you talk to somebody, how can you do it more effectively? And then if we have time, again, we'll talk about the plan for the next round of interviews. I think this part might actually, this final point might end up taking place after the class in the back leaves and we're kind of in workshop mode. So why bother doing this? Again, it sounds kind of like a difficult question, maybe, but it's a fair question. Why bother talking to people when you can look at secondary data, when you have a whole bunch of analytics, when you know the trends, maybe you think you know the industry, you know the customer. The analogy that I always like to think of is as an entrepreneur, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to open a particular kind of lock. And there's a lot of different approaches to it. I mean, admittedly, you could cut the lock or bash the lock or something, but again, that doesn't really work too well with customers because it has to be a voluntary transaction eventually, right? One way to do it would be really cool. We program up, maybe a machine learning algorithm, right, to do 7,000 different keys and see which one works, maybe 700,000 different keys. There's some situations where that might work, but in general, in the startup world, that doesn't work particularly well. Because every time you come up with a new key, really, that key is pretty darn expensive, right? It burns time, it burns attention, it burns money to try that certain thing. So what we're going to try to do here is use these interviewing techniques to go out and see if we can really understand how that lock is made. See if we can understand the inner workings of the lock before we jump to designing the key. And one of the reasons that this is so important is that all of us are racked with psychological bias. And this isn't bias in the bad way of using the term. This just means the biases that we have toward sort of certain patterns of action, certain ways we see the world. And we all have these to a greater or lesser extent. It doesn't matter how illustrious your career is or how long your CV is or anything else. In fact, the folks who do the best with not having these biases are actually kids. A lot of this is built on things that we've seen in the past. Even something as simple as anchoring bias. Anchoring bias, that means that whatever the first piece of information that's thrown out there is the one that we tend to anchor on and rotate around. This happens in salary negotiations, but it absolutely happens in startups too. The first market, the market for our thing that comes to mind, it may be totally arbitrary why we thought of it. Maybe it's not. Maybe it actually has to do with this thing called the availability heuristic. Maybe we think that's the market because that's the market we're closest to, so we think it's the best one. But with anchoring, what happens is if you're not careful, if you don't really explore broadly for different markets or different options, you can end up obsessing about that one just because it was first, not because it was better. And it's not necessarily better because it was first. Does that make sense? So again, what we're doing here is a systematic process to sort of make sure we have the perspective of a beginner and go out there and really learn. And it's kind of a challenging thing to do. One of my favorite infographics here, again, a little bit of a small screen, but it's worth to take a look at. You know, I've done a bunch of different biases that can affect our decision making. And again, the more that we think this doesn't apply to us, the more that should be a red flag to you that it probably does, right? Not every one of these is going to be sort of dominant in every situation, but it's incredibly important to try to kind of rid your analysis of these. And one of the ways that you do that, again, is by going out into the field, by interviewing customers, by taking what they say and what they do, sort of at face value. Again, not trying to kind of pass judgments on it, but just really trying to understand how and why it happens, even if it doesn't make sense to you. And now, some of you heard the story before, including my class. But the reason that I'm so passionate about this particular topic is I have screwed this up a number of times, royally screwed this up. This is actually at a time before there was training for this particular approach. One of the startups that I was a co-founder of is called TakeShape. The idea is really kind of basic. And again, as somebody who likes technology commercialization, I thought it was awesome. We took a technology that some of you probably recognize, right? Everybody's seen these at airports. Turns out that you can take the same hardware, you change out the software, and this system can actually tell you a lot of interesting things about health and fitness metrics. Because what it's doing in the airport is it's building a point cloud, a 3D model of your body, and it's looking for things that don't belong. So sometimes that might be something metallic, right, like a gun, but one of the reasons this was developed was to look for non-metallic threats, right, that traditional metal detectors didn't work well on. So we licensed this from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Had this idea that wouldn't it be cool to have basically a health scanner that you go into. The power in this is radio waves, so it's 1/500th the power of a cell phone. So this isn't ionizing radiation, this isn't CAT scans and all that great stuff that you have at the hospital. And we thought that a cool initial market for this, or initial market that would be interesting, would be high-end college athletic departments and professional sports teams, right? For anybody who's really interested in kind of really keeping track of how the bodies of their athletes are changing. There was even some evidence that you could predict injury. Not 100% of the time, but it turns out that if you were training really hard for something and your muscles became asymmetric, that actually could be a sign that you eventually were going to hurt yourself. So the founders were all MBAs. 3 of us had backgrounds in manufacturing. We thought this was great. We looked at the alternatives that were out there, this thing called the bod pod, which is this weird sort of like pod thing you go into, and it actually does the same measurements with air pressure. There's also dunk tanks that hospitals have sometimes where you get dunked and it actually does a really a sort of accurate measure of your body volume. Those were all really accurate, but they took a long time. And the idea was, and they were expensive. So the idea, if you're going to run a whole 100-person NFL team through this, actually a 58-person NFL team through it, that it would take a long time. A lot of facilities didn't have them, so we were offering this as an alternative. Luckily, one of my co-founders, two of them played college football, one played at University of Texas. So we went down to try to pitch the University of Texas on our gadget. And our initial pitch, again, doing what I'm telling you not to do, was we said, hey, you can run your whole team through here, 3 seconds a person, comes through, everybody can run through super quick. It's really accurate, right? Accurate down to like a tenth or even a hundredth of a millimeter. You can keep track of how their bodies change over time as they condition and as they work out or recover from injury. And then we also said, you know what's great about this is you don't have to hire a bunch of people with tape measures and calipers to keep track of the same data. So they thought that was okay. But again, what was our big assumption here that we just blew right by, didn't even consider from a customer's perspective? Yeah.
That they wanted data.
We assumed that they wanted the data, which they did, and they liked the accuracy part of it. But again, we probably should have asked that, right? Like we sort of asked kind of how do you keep track of these things now? That's how we knew about the calipers and how we knew about the measuring case. That's a good guess. So again, even with the background in manufacturing, we were thinking about higher quality, and we were thinking about higher throughput, right? Generally things that are good, right? You have a system that can help with that, things that are more accurate and give you more throughput. But what was interesting, and this only happened an hour into the conversation, right? And the person who was in charge of equipment started asking us questions like, can you make it light up orange? Now think about it. From our perspective, MBAs, manufacturing backgrounds, higher throughput, better accuracy, cut costs, can it light up orange? It was interesting too, because the cutting cost part, right? Everybody likes cutting costs. Who here follows college football even a little bit? Okay, is the University of Texas football program low on money? No, they're not. It turns out also the people doing measurement didn't cost them anything because they were interning from like the PT department or something, right? But they started asking us about it lighting up orange, and my students know the kind of the how this turned out. But what were they after? Why do they want to light up orange? Our reaction was, yeah, I can take 6 million data points in 3 seconds, right? Of course it can light up orange. Can you possibly wire LEDs in that are orange? Yeah, of course you can. Easy, right? What were they asking with that question? What did we just totally blow by, despite the fact that 2 of our founders played college football, one for Texas and one for Nebraska?
They wanted it personalized or just for them?
Personalized, and why would they want it personalized? Yeah.
Is it something they wanted to show off at games, like how much they were growing?
You're closer, they're showing it off, but not at the games, yeah.
Well, they're probably showing it off to donors, but they also are they interested in it being exclusive so they have a competitive advantage?
Now all of 3 of those. It turns out what they're really interested in, which makes sense, is the primary kind of value driver in college football is recruiting. So they want to look like the highest tech, most cutting edge program out there, maybe to donors to a certain extent, but donors also, they kind of don't care what you're doing as long as you win to a certain extent, right? So, but it was actually to high school students, right? So some kid out in some West Texas town who runs like a 4.240, that's who they cared about. They wanted them to show up in Austin and think this is awesome. And then speaking of competitive advantage, they sort of dropped the hint that they would buy 2 if we didn't sell 1 to Oklahoma. So those again who keep track of these kind of things, Oklahoma is the big rival. So the reason why I use this example is we blew in there with this value proposition that we thought that they had a job to do and that they wanted to reduce costs and increase throughput. We were completely wrong. And it was only because we continued this conversation. And we should have started with questions like, how do you decide what equipment to buy? Right? We just assumed that they wanted this because it was cheaper, because it was more accurate, all these kind of MBA metrics that we've learned about. And there are some places where that might matter. And think about this, the next people we went and talked to were a NFL team, because one of our advisors' brother was the chief physician for an NFL team. Did the NFL team care if it lit up blue? No. Does the NFL recruit? No, they pay professionals a ton of money and they say show up to work. But what did they care about? We got better at it by this time, trying to figure out, just open book. What do you care about when you buy equipment? What do you think they care about?
The data.
They care about the data, but why?
Injury prediction.
Injury, exactly. Injury and recovery. So to frame this in kind of broader sort of business school terms, they cared about protecting their assets. both in terms of recovering and whether or not they could predict. And again, we didn't have to be 100%. This isn't sort of the medical world or anything like that. If we could predict, even if we could improve prediction even 5 or 10%, that's huge, right? Because obviously if one player goes down on an NFL roster, especially if they're a star, it can have an impact for the entire business, if you will. So that's what they were interested in. Our third group of customers that we talked to were in high-end gyms. What do you think that they cared about? Injury prediction a little bit, but again, they were nervous about offering injury prediction services to their customers because of all kinds of liability reasons and all that, right? What were they most interested in? Well, it turns out, and again, we got better at asking questions. It turns out that high-end gyms make about 60% of their revenue from selling additional services. So they were really curious about whether their customers were willing to pay extra for this, which is really interesting to think about. So again, I use this.
Did you go to University of Oklahoma then after?
What's that?
Did you go to University of Oklahoma after?
We didn't after that. No, we took that sort of threat and offer very seriously, right? But again, I offer this as a real world example where we kind of bungled into this, and I'm trying to save you some of that time. Because frankly, we got lucky. If one of my co-founders wouldn't have played for University of Texas, we may not have gotten in the door. But even if we did, I don't think that they would have spent hours talking to us, taking us out to lunch, doing all these things that eventually got us to understand what really creates value for them. So again, we're going to try to shortcut the mistakes that I made with the process that we're going to learn about right now. So from the lean launchpad perspective, the lean startup perspective, your job is to move around this particular cycle as fast as you can. You're going to come up with something and resist the urge to perfect it. You need to build something. Build, it could be physically build, or we'll talk about a couple of other ways to build what we call minimally viable products. And then start to experiment and learn. Again, we didn't actually have to we had a working prototype, but we didn't have to ship it down to Texas to be able to explain to them what was going on, right? So we had a working prototype, and again, we were able to kind of just explain with pictures and with videos what was going on. And it allowed us to go through this experiment, which is like, okay, if we're going to go market this to other college teams, it has to be branded, it has to be focused on recruiting, it has to be all of these other things. So how you actually do this, and I'm going to challenge you to become sort of an old-timey anthropologist, somebody who wears a pith helmet and goes out in the wilderness to try to understand the world. Imagine your customers as a tribe or a group or an organization that you know nothing about. Now, I realize many of you have some insights into your particular field or your particular customer, but I'm asking you again to try to use those beginner's eyes to go out there and really see if you can uncover things that maybe are new or interesting or different. So I want you to go out there, and I want you to go out and see if you can really try to understand what's going on. So imagine you're going, again, so you're going to Lapland, you're going to northern Scandinavia, and you want to observe the Sami people that live there and figure out why they do what they do. You see how different that is than selling? You're not going up there and telling them that they should do things differently. You're not going out there with an assumption that you know what they should do and they don't know what they do. But I mean, little things like why is the baby on the side of the reindeer in that thing that looks like a sweet potato? Why do you think that they shape things that way? I literally have no idea. It's an open question, right? But again, once you get into the industry and start talking to people, whether it's your immediate customer or possibly gatekeepers in that industry, you'll start kind of uncovering these kind of things. And again, we should have known in the situation with Take Shape that recruiting is primarily what drives major college football. There's other things that go on, but it all starts with recruiting. It all starts with you recruit the best players, have a good coach, donors are happy, everyone else is happy, and the whole thing works. If you're not good at recruiting, or you can't hire somebody that's good at recruiting, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So again, try to think about yourselves as an anthropologist, even if that's not your training, and go out there as judgment-free as possible, really open to new and surprising things, rather than in the mode of selling or even informing. Inform enough so they have a general sense of what's going on. But again, if you go to somebody, it's not about debating the details of the technology necessarily. And you might find yourself, again, even interviewing the wrong tribe, making a mistake. If we would have gone to high-end gyms first, that probably would have been a mistake. It was only after we went to major college athletics in the NFL that almost every door you could imagine opened in terms of high-end gyms. You can imagine that, right? If I expect my members to pay extra for this service, it's really compelling to say it's also used by the NFL, right? Trying to do that the other way around would have been difficult. So again, the mode that you should be in right now is the mode of search. The mode of searching for a business model with all the components that we've looked at, with most focus that we've had over here. It's a really bad picture, it's small, but on the development of the value proposition. And the goal here is really to search and then eventually to test each and every one of these components. An example I can use from our class in the back is a lot of students, when they're thinking about a business launch, they want to say, my business is an app. So your business is never an app. An app is actually just one little box. It's the channel by which you may reach your customers. And maybe that's the right channel, maybe it's not, right? But the business itself is not an app. So you want to actually go out there and you want to test each and every one of these hypotheses, starting with the hypotheses around the value proposition. Again, those are the ones I shared with the scanning business. Again, we totally changed our value proposition after we learned that, what we led with, why we thought this was interesting, right? And then how we ask you to do this, or how we sort of, the guidance we provide in doing this, really starts with something called a minimally viable product. So again, you want to kind of summarize what you're doing in terms of your current hypotheses across the entire business model canvas, especially focused on the value proposition. And this is kind of one of those things that's a little bit difficult to do, but it's actually really important. It's much better to start with a rough idea sooner and start the process than it is to try to think about the right answers in those boxes. You all have hypotheses in each and every one of those things, even if they're implied. So just write those down and start running from there. The next thing you need to do is actually get outside the building. I know we've talked about that quite a bit. We're going to do a simulation of that sort of later on. So you can get outside the building if you're a startup and interview customers. But if you're in a building with people with diverse backgrounds and perspectives like you are here, it's actually a really great place to practice. So we're going to do a little bit of that later on in class. And then we're going to ask you to start thinking about creating what we call a minimally viable product. And this is kind of a strange concept, but it's actually a pretty important one. And there's a lot of examples out there. There's a good one about a minimally viable product for a car is a skateboard, not the sketch of a car. And again, what a minimally viable product is something easy and cheap to build that tests the most fundamental assumption that you're making in your business. And again, if you're a car company, you're not necessarily testing what kind of car people want. You're testing about whether or not there's a demand for transportation services. And so if you end up renting people skateboards, for example, that provides transportation services. People could say, okay, I need it to be bigger, I need it to be safer, I need it to be easier to go uphill. Those are all things you can design around, right? But again, if you start the other way and you give somebody a model of a car and ask them if they like it, that doesn't actually give you any information about whether or not that person values transportation services. Does that make sense? Another example I really like is, let's say you were the inventor of the light bulb. Imagine trying to sell people a light bulb before electricity was widely available, trying to explain to them what the concept was. Well, a minimally viable product for a light bulb is actually a candle. Because what's the assumption that you're testing? Not that the world will be lit with candles, right? Not the assumption. What's the assumption?
There's a demand for light sources.
Yeah, for portable light sources, right? And you can imagine building off that. And again, obviously, we know that there's a demand for light sources again, but it's an analogy I think that works pretty well. So a minimally viable product is something that you can show people. It's like the cheapest, easiest thing you can show people, either tangibly or intangibly, to have them really understand what you're trying to do. And I actually have a video that I like that goes through 3 different minimally viable products. And it does a couple in software and one in sort of retail and platforms. So again, I don't want us to get too obsessed about this idea of a product, because I know not everybody in here is working on a product-based venture. But take a look at these. I think these are pretty good examples of how the speakers work, of minimally viable products. One of these is lesser known and 2 are super famous. So let's see.
Hey, I just created a professional Wix site for my business. Let's check it out. Go to Wix.com. One of the greatest minimum viable products of all time. Absolutely. Here are 3 of my favorites. Hi, this is Gary. Welcome to Development Debates. Today we're going to take a look at 3 of my favorite examples of minimum viable products. Before diving in, let's establish some ground rules for a proper be minimal, it's going to be viable, and it's good.
If I bring it outside of Paul College, CIT is always a little bit different.
I just need to reshare that if you're in a different window or something.
Yeah. Oh, it'll be to even get up on the screen here, but yeah, it's still sharing. Let me see if I can just do it with Apple setup. Okay, now that's totally frozen, so we're just gonna kind of go with it. So I'll explain the two famous ones. One of the famous ones is for Dropbox. Anybody use the service Dropbox? So it turns out when Dropbox was being developed, it was really tricky to get it to work really well across all different platforms. So the traditional way to do this would be to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the files sync properly across mobile and desktop and iOS and Android and PC and everything else. But the founders actually did something totally different. Their minimally viable product, because their product was really buggy and barely worked, was actually a video demonstration of them doing this just on the PC. And it actually took a couple of times for them to even do the video because it kept crashing. But does everybody understand what that did for them? It allowed them to go out and actually show people in a world before this idea of having all your files synced to the cloud was a normal thing. They didn't have to explain it, they could actually show it. But they weren't allowed, people were not allowed to interact with it. But it still worked really well, because you could say, okay, I'm on these different devices, here's my file, here's a file that I'm saving here and here and here. And so again, Dropbox raised money based on that before they actually built a fully functioning Dropbox as we know it. And it allowed them to test really the main assumption of their business, which is that people wanted this kind of service. And again, and now it's obvious, right? We all use these kind of services, but at the time it wasn't obvious, right? Anybody ever make the transition and worried about having all of their vital files in the cloud? Anybody still a little iffy on it, right? I know a lot of people certainly are. But everybody see how they invested just in that video. Very, very simple. I mean, I think it was maybe even shot on an iPhone. It was a very simple video that, again, provided a minimal product. It was viable in the sense that it was viable to people that understand what they were doing and why that might help. And it was a product only in the sense that the product was shown, but they couldn't actually kind of work with it. The other example of this that I really love comes from Zappos, the online shoe company. And this is like the ultimately minimally viable product. The main assumption for their business was not how to deal with returns and shipping, how to build a brand. The main assumption for their company was, will people even buy shoes online? Or will enough people buy shoes online to be able to make a business? You know, other things have been sold online, but shoes are a tricky thing, right? How exactly they feel, how exactly they look, people's feet are different shapes, all that kind of stuff. So they could have done what a lot of the late 90s online retail startups did. They could have gotten warehousing and inventory, spent money on advertising at the Super Bowl and everything else, literally pets.com, right? And other famous failures of the internet era. But what the founders did instead is they said, hey, we can test this. And so they actually went down to local shoe stores and they took pictures of shoes. They built a very simple website, put those shoes on the website for sale. And then only when somebody bought those did they go back to the store and buy the shoes, ship them to the customer. So nothing about that is efficient. Nothing about that is elegant at all. And in fact, it's the opposite of all of those. But think about it. It allowed them to test that most fundamental assumption, the assumption that if they got it wrong, it would blow up the entire business. They could test that with minimal effort and literally no money, or almost no money, right? So again, that's kind of spirit. I want you to kind of keep hacking and getting cheaper and easier and cheaper and easier and more creative so you come up with a minimally viable product that you can show people that doesn't involve fully programming an app, doesn't involve a fully fledged product or anything else. And again, the reason why you do this is that let's say Zappos got it wrong. Let's say they couldn't sell shoes online, but they could sell jackets online. They could do the exact same thing for almost every other line of clothing. Maybe they sell purses online. They probably could have done 100 experiments or more for the price of setting up full shop on shoes, assuming that people were actually going to do that, and then trying to kind of go out and have people actually sell those particular products. So how to do this in kind of a systematic way? There's no way around this. It's going to be awkward. It really is. If you're talking to colleagues in your field that you've known for a long time, it'll still be awkward. If you're cold calling people, it will be awkward. If you're talking to people at trade shows, Mark may have mentioned last time, trade shows are a great place to go to do this kind of stuff. Trade shows are maybe a little less awkward because people aren't there to talk to people, right? But it's going to be awkward. It's going to feel strange. Some of these ideas are not new to the people in the room, but others I know are working on kind of brand new ideas. People have different roles on the team. People have different professional backgrounds. So just get ready for things to be a little strange. And if they don't go perfectly, it's a great time to sort of regroup and learn rather than sort of quit. So I don't mean to pick on the scientists and engineers in the room, but a lot of you all are featured in the book Talking to Humans. You know, we have this idea sometimes that we actually don't want to go out and talk to customers because they already know what they want. And that's what we had, right? We say, hey, we got 2 college football players on our founding team. We got this great professional background. We know every company wants to cut costs, increase throughput, raise quality. Especially, you know, if you can do all 3 of those at the same time, it's a home run. And of course, we were dead wrong. So again, even if you go out there with those assumptions and you're right, or you're 90% right, you're doing better than almost everyone else in the world. And that's great, but now you actually have a reason to say, I know why I'm right. Does that make sense? So again, go out there and do it. It can be a little bit difficult, it can be a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you're going out there with something that's not perfected. And as an academic myself, I understand the pressure of going out and presenting in front of colleagues. And you don't want to present a half-baked idea. You don't want to present a poor analysis. Again, it's a difficult thing to try to do. And an MVP, though, done right, is not a crappy version of the end product. Does that make sense? It's a product that actually has the best features of the end product. And the other thing is when you get it in front of people who are open-minded and who are potential early adopters, they'll understand, hey, this isn't perfect, but I see what you're going for here. I see the potential, right? And that's kind of the reaction that we want to get. So not picking on sort of my own tribe, if I will. Business people, myself included, are terrible about this. So we're going to have some mediocre product that we haven't thought through really well, but man, we'll build a great brand. You know, we'll get some investment, get this awesome logo. We'll yell social media and brand, and everything will be taken care of. Maybe I'll say millennial. You know, that'll be good. I'm 6 days too old to be a millennial, so I can talk about millennials to others, right? But again, all these kind of buzzwords, sort of nonsense. Eventually, yeah, you want to get your package right? You really want to think about how this is going to be delivered and how your brand's perceived. But normally there's something more fundamental that you've got to test. Whether or not this is really creating value for the customers that you think it is. And alternatively, are there another set of customers that maybe you're ignoring while you're focusing on this kind of minutia? I love this one. And this is, again, my class has heard this story. I had a version of this very same thing happen a couple of years ago in my class. 2 young men had this great idea to make a low-calorie, zero-calorie, actually, hard cider product. Their observations are that people liked to drink hard cider, and it was becoming really, really popular. But people were worried, according to them, primarily women aged 21 to 31, I think was their demographic, about the amount of calories in a hard cider. I never actually thought about the amount of calories in hard cider, but they pointed out, hey, there are 200 calories per bottle, and when you drink 8 of them, that's 1,600 calories. So who here has drank 8 hard ciders recently in one? Don't actually raise your hand. Even hearing that gave me a headache, right? So again, if I had been developing this, I would have thought, okay, what's really the difference between a 200 calorie cider and a 100 calorie cider? I don't really know, right? But you multiply it by 8 and it actually becomes significant. So they were going through this whole thing, right? And it turns out that the target demographic was women 21 to 30 who enjoyed going out and liked cider. And I started asking him about how they knew all of this stuff. And it turns out they didn't. They were actually just assuming. They had heard some whispers at the bar one night, and so they actually started experimenting with this. Well, all the people that were 21. The other funny thing is they're UNH students, and they said, well, if we're going to experiment with different cider recipes, like where can we possibly find people in our target demographic? And it took me a second, and I was like, there's literally 5,000 of them on campus, right, that are probably over 21, and how hard of a sell is it to say, hey, I'm making a new hard cider product, would you want to try it? And that's not a hard sell at all. But what they did is they actually did a whole bunch of testing, and thankfully they were bailed out by a woman in class who said, hey, myself and all my friends would love to be your test subjects. We'd like to try all of these different formulations of your cider. And what they found out, again, is that they totally had it They had it mostly wrong. The part that they had wrong was not that there was a market for a 0-calorie cider, but just a lower calorie cider. The other thing that they figured out is anytime they added any kind of fake sugar sweetener or anything to their cider, it tasted absolutely awful, and nobody wanted it. And of course, they did this by just going and getting really dry cider and adding different sweet levels of sweetener to it, and just doing tests with a few dozen people. And then what they ended up figuring out was that there's a way to ferment cider and using particular varieties of apples where you can actually make a product that has about half the number of calories and still tastes really, really good. What, of course, they missed was thinking maybe even more broadly about the relationship between alcohol and calories in the movement toward healthier alcoholic beverages. And what they really missed out on was the movement to things like White Claw, right? We talked about this a few times in class. I mean, literally, it's like putting cheap vodka into seltzer, and it's now nearly $1 billion business, like $635 million market, right? It's crazy. But again, they were suffering from this. They were imagining what their customers wanted based on little anecdotes without actually going out and testing, when the testing was right there in front of them. It didn't require a lot of money. And at first, what they were going to do is that they wanted to raise a few $100,000 to go do a contract with a brewer to make this cider, brew essentially all of the sugar out of it and dump a bunch of Splenda in. And they had labels, they had a name, they were going to go market it. I mean, just total branding exercise. They were going to risk hundreds of thousands of dollars of their family's money and maybe investors' money before testing that basic assumption, which is like, is this even the way? So when you go out there and you start talking, this is sort of almost like a mantra I want you to think about. It's about learning. Think of yourself as an anthropologist if that helps, or as a detective if that helps. You're trying to figure out what is going on behind the scenes. I don't see anybody from this group that was in I-Corps last spring, but another great example, again, from I-Corps that I really love seeing the way that this team kind of worked through this, is that there was a team working on a test that could identify fish fraud. Is there anybody from that team in here? Thought maybe it was a mentor or something. But it turns out it's actually a really big issue. It was my wife's birthday last night, so we actually went out for sushi. So it's kind of like one of the reasons this example popped into mind. But the idea here is that they had this really cool, very like scientifically valid test to be able to tell one fish species from another. And again, if you're out there actually catching fish, hopefully you're doing that yourself. But when fish get processed and cut up, it can actually be incredibly difficult. Even things like different varieties of salmon, farm salmon versus fresh salmon. What are you really buying? And so they had this idea that they had a real problem they wanted to solve. They had a great, solution. My understanding is that's intellectual property around it, sort of a clear need. And if you went out and started asking just regular customers about this, what's kind of the assumption that you're making? Yeah. That people really care about fish fraud. That people really care or are aware of it, or are out there looking for a solution to it. So it's a problem in sort of a global fish market sort of way, but for the individual, is this something that they're thinking about? So that's one possible customer group, right? You build a business around, I don't know, selling people strips that they can wipe on the fish in a sushi market and see. I mean, that maybe, right? Something to explore. Where else could they look? Who else could be a group of customers? Yeah.
Well, people who are selling the good stuff don't want cheap stuff being substituted for them. So they're, people who are the ones who stand to make the money by selling the right things. So
Yeah. So you could actually have a whole bunch of people. That's why I was kind of thinking this whole seafood supply chain thing here, right? Is really figuring out not just who would like this, who would think it's interesting, but who has kind of the burning need to kind of do this, right? And so they start talking to people like chefs. Right? If you're a chef at like a high-end fish restaurant, like a Jumpin' Jay's or something like that, and you're charging people $30, $35 a plate for seafood, even if it comes from a supplier, you may want to double check, right? And when they went and talked to some chefs, it was sort of like, well, I trust my supplier. Okay. Maybe you go talk to some suppliers, right? Suppliers, maybe some of them source locally, they buy it right from the boat and they actually see it. Others might not. Another thing that's interesting that's buried in there is we're actually assuming that the customers value knowing what species the fish is. Maybe that's an overbuilt product. Maybe just knowing about whether or not it's farmed is good enough. Maybe that's really what they want to know. Maybe I'm an importer of salmon and I really want to know whether or not it's actually wild or whether it's farmed. But again, we're all sitting here speculating. We're assuming more information the better. So is knowing the species what the customer wants? Is knowing the subspecies? If it's salmon, if it's in one of those situations where I actually need to be able to tell whether or not it's sockeye or silver salmon or chump salmon, I'm from Seattle, so I go on a lot about salmon, I like it. But that can be really difficult, right? And in the market, those different fishes look very, very similar, that are all wild, actually fetch a very different price.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think of legal seafood, and their value proposition was they went to the boat, they made sure it was fresh,
Yeah.
they made sure it wasn't out for more than a couple days before they brought it back. So, again, I still think it gets down to who's selling the fish and who's selling the
Yeah.
premium fish.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one way or another,
Yeah.
they're the ones who are hurt by counterfeit.
Do they, and figuring out really who cares about this the most.
And the people go to legal care because they know,
Yeah.
they know for its story.
And maybe when legal is competing against other competitors in the market to say that it's actually sort of scientifically verified that this is
Right.
fish actually might be something that they would find value in. What about like a grocery store? What might they care about? Why might they want to test their fish? Yeah.
There are a couple of those fish that are often substituted that make people sick.
That's right. Yeah. So you say that you're selling salmon. And again, I'm having visions of eating sushi with my dinner last night, but it's really a fish called escaril or something like that. Yeah, something along the line. Looks exactly like salmon, tastes very like salmon, very much like salmon, but people can have allergic reactions to it, and people can get really, really sick from eating it. Not everybody, but a lot of people, and it's very common to have that substituted in sushi, right? So again, the example here is not saying, hey, I built this kit, let me go sell you the service. You start asking questions about like, how do you decide which seafood to buy, right? How do you verify it actually is what it is? Maybe somebody says, well, I only buy seafood from North America and Europe, and we know there's this legal certification process. But as we saw a couple of years ago in Europe, right, that didn't work particularly well for horse meat ending up in the food chain, right? So again, this actually allows them to test. Maybe there's somebody in, maybe it's a B2G model. Maybe there's actually somebody in, I don't know, the EPA or something that does testing or something, or I don't know exactly what the right agency would be if anybody is actually checking this stuff. But it's a matter of diving in and saying, okay, we know that the science works. Let's actually think about where we should apply it. What would be a good minimally viable product for this? If it has to be done in a lab. Again, how's a cheap way you could actually determine whether or not this created value? What do you think? You know it works at a bench scale. Let's think about just going to Portsmouth. What could you do over there to come up with a minimally viable product? What could you offer? Somebody in the seafood supply chain, a restaurant, say, hey, we got this idea. How can we actually sort of do this testing for you? How do we test whether or not this is something you actually find valuable? Eventually, I think they want to do some kind of small and handheld or stuff. What could you do?
Well, I would approach the chef at a particular restaurant, just work with one, see how it works there.
Yeah.
I think back, I went to a restaurant with a group of people and somebody said, this is wild salmon, waiter.
Yeah.
And somebody next to me breaks up laughing and all
Yeah.
that, no way, and blah, blah, blah. So I don't think you need much. I just think, you start one place and try it.
Yeah. Yeah. You could work with a chef, and I think there's a lot of chefs that would actually want to know this. Maybe a distributor. You could be even more guerrilla, and you could go into Hannaford, and you could buy 1 ounce of every fish that they have, and you could test them, right? See if it's even a problem. And then imagine going back to them, and I mean, it would be a little bit of a tricky conversation to their seafood buyer and saying, you know what, 40% of this is not what you say it is. And there's a chance, right, that they could be doing that on purpose, but I imagine for a big brand like that, I doubt it. I imagine there's somewhere along the way that things got swapped out. Yeah.
I've just worked with one, whether it's a chef or one company and one type of fish.
Yeah.
Just one.
Yeah. Start really narrow, right? And again, you could learn a lot, right? Is it the farm versus wild thing that matters the most? Is it where it's caught that matters the most? Is it the variety of tuna that matters the most? I'm just wildly speculating with somebody who likes seafood. But the point is, when you go out and actually start talking to people, they'll tell you a lot about this, right? Again, I only buy from a really trusted supplier who uses local boats. Maybe that's the case. I have no need for this at all. Others might want to say, you know what? I'm not sure if I want to know. That came up a few years ago in a story, and it wasn't at UNH, but it was a friend of mine who runs a similar workshop. There was a system for detecting leaks in underground tanks for gasoline and other things. Much more accurate than any existing system. And again, we assume as scientists, even social scientists, the more accuracy, the better, right? Nobody likes, I don't think anybody likes oil and gas leaks into the groundwater and things. So having a system that's better, great. So we're going to go out and we're going to try to sell it to people who own these tanks, or sell a service that allows them to inspect their tanks. What were the owners of the tanks worried about? They didn't want to know, right? They had certain standards that they needed to meet, and they met them. Going beyond those standards were something that they weren't necessarily interested in, because that turns out to be a massive cleanup operation. And again, that may be a commentary on too loose of regulations or whatever. Again, we're not here to do that. But again, that assumption that more accuracy was better was exactly wrong. And it wasn't until they actually built the product, built the company, and went and tried to sell the service that they realized that. So we're trying to catch that kind of thing earlier rather than later. Another example I like to use is, imagine you had developed a new polymer. And this is actually what happened with this company called Purple. And they said, hey, we're going to make this into a pillow. How would you actually go and try to understand this market? The reason I use this is it's super pedestrian. Like, most people can't remember the last time they bought a pillow. A lot of students say that they've never bought one, whatever their mom gave them when they moved into the dorm, whatever it happens to be. I have little kids, so it's like whatever I ordered at 3 in the morning off of Amazon when I was sleep deprived, and I was hoping would magically help, me and my kids sleep, right? But how would you actually go and understand this process? I mean, you're making a big assumption, first of all, that this polymer should be used for this particular purpose. But if you really wanted to go out and understand the customer, how would you do it? Think about yourself as an anthropologist or detective. Yeah.
I'd go hang out at Bed and Bath or something like
Yeah.
that, talk to people who are buying pillows.
Yeah. And would that be awkward?
Yeah.
Yes. Like, I promise you it would be awkward, right? But you'd learn a lot, right? Did people look at the packaging? Did they try them out? Do they smell them? Because some of these polymers kind of smell pretty weird. If they, and then when you start talking to them, you could ask them about why they were buying one, whether or not the idea of returning one would be, compelling or not. Realistically, people don't return them.
People walk you out and you have to go to the next store.
Yeah, and then you kind of, apologize. The other thing you could do too is just, go do a mile in their shoes, right? Even if you don't need to go buy a pillow, just go do it. Go check it out. Go actually think through the experience, which is not something, again, that, probably we're used to doing. It's something that people just kind of grab, right? And then what was mentioned now here too is really try to figure out a way you can observe things in a naturalistic way. This is not always possible. If you're trying to get into a secured lab or something like that, it can be difficult. But be creative in this way, some way you can actually observe customers. Don't make assumptions about how or why they do what they do. Really see if you can go observe. Going back to the fish example, maybe you go hang out at the down in Portsmouth or somewhere else and actually see how the fish is processed. When does it go from becoming a recognizable species to just a slab of something that we, throw on the grill, right? So really think about doing this, right? Think about going out and not just saying we have a better pillow because it has more support and superior heat transfer capabilities or anything like that. You got to go make sure that the customers actually care about those kind of things. And again, I use this as kind of a almost random example because it's a really sort of one of those things we don't really think about. The other thing that's really fascinating is don't just think about the moment of purchase. Think about everything that goes into before that, how people are doing research about that. And again, stores are going through kind of an interesting transformation where people still go to stores, but a lot of times it's just to buy something that they were going to buy anyway. It's kind of like the click and collect idea, right? Where the research and the informative part of everything has kind of moved online. You also see that in markets like auto sales. If anybody's bought a car lately, some people go like the old-timey way of like, I go in, I drive all these cars, I talk the salesperson down and all that. But the single biggest seller of cars in the US right now is actually Costco wholesale. So Costco they can't sell cars themselves, but they negotiate the deal. And I've done this before. The car that I bought, they negotiate the price, negotiate everything. You literally walk in and you sign the papers and away you go. Actually, a fun metric. The number of people that have test driven the car before they bought it has dropped to about 60%. Can you imagine that? Deciding what car you want, not even test driving it, and going in and getting it. And again, so really think about that, whether it's a B2B, B2G, or B2C model. Really understand what goes on beforehand. A graduate of this program last spring is selling his platform into government agencies. And I just met with him yesterday. I'm on his board. And it was a whole lesson in understanding, in this case, the sales cycle into a public entity is like nothing he had ever seen before. He's moving fast and breaking things, sort of, and he's an entrepreneur, and everything happens fast. And then you run into the process of state contracting, right? And again, he could have done a little bit more before the moment of purchase to say, okay, whatever is bought for the state or for the university or for the Department of Defense, it doesn't just happen. It's not somebody saying, yeah, we'll take that, right? And again, educating on yourself and observing that on that process can be really useful. Last point here, and then we'll let the back group transition and we'll kind of go into workshop mode, is ideally you would get to the kind of the best customer that can give you the most insight into whether or not your value proposition resonates with them. Those people can be difficult to access, and honestly, it can surprise you as to who that customer group actually is. So start pretty wide and start where you can. And then once you start where you can, that could be with a warm contact, it could be somebody in this room, it could be somebody in your professional network. Then start what we call snowball sampling. Start asking them to refer you to other people. This happened a couple of years ago with the same class that was in the back, where some people were working on a new type of wooden core for a snowboard. It was made from a type of wood that couldn't be used for many other purposes because it had been damaged by beetles, but structurally it still worked really, really well for snowboards. And they were trying to figure out how to get in contact with a manufacturer of snowboards and skis. And it turns out that in a class of 17 or 18 people, one of the other students' uncle owned the largest snowboard and ski manufacturing facility in all of Canada. And they basically said, hey, would you like to talk to my Uncle Steve or whatever? And of course, Steve was happy to talk to them, right? Say, hey, here's my classmates are working on this. We got just a mountain of insider information on how Steve and the companies and the brands he worked with, how they decided what components went into which snowboard. And again, they just happen to be in the same group, right? So start where you can. And then they were also able to leverage his contacts in the industry because he's been in the industry forever and knows everyone else in that industry, right? So again, think about starting where you can, even if it's not the ideal customer, and then letting that sort of lead you into customers that either you might not know directly or even into different customer groups that might actually end up being that point in the market. So I'm not going to read off all these. I do this for my students too. This is more of like a checklist to go back to. I know everybody has busy lives, so if a week or two from now you're like, what did Professor Earle even talk about? This is basically the checklist of sort of do's and don'ts, right? Really trying to get into that behavioral thing and be explicit about your assumptions, test them and test the risk. And then just keep going. You'll learn. It's a process, not an event. Learn, coach one another, help one another out. Practice it, get better, be honest with yourself. If you went too much into sales mode, try to figure out how you can shift out of that. And then this is actually a really important thing down here. In general, more interviews is better, but not if the interviews aren't generating additional insights. So we're not actually after some sort of sampling procedure, looking at statistical significance. Eventually, you might be able to get there with a survey and other things. But right now, we're doing something much more fundamental, which is recognizing these basic patterns. If you want to eventually do a survey, you can think about what we're trying to do now is to figure out which questions should even be on the survey and who it should even be sent to. Does that make sense? So survey doesn't count for this particular workshop, particular class. It's because, again, we're further back up the funnel than that, trying to figure out what's, again, the right question to ask to begin with. So with that, I'm going to let my class go at 5 o'clock. If you need to, you're welcome to sit around. Thank you for joining us, walking down here in the rain. Have a great weekend, and I'll see everyone on Monday. And then I want to have a snack. And now it's going to be time to share some of your experiences. And again, the more honest we can be, the better. We learn from one another. It's a non-competitive arena, if you will. So I really want to hear from each team. I'll just kind of work from the front to the back, like what worked and what didn't in terms of getting in the door. So again, I challenge you to kind of be on this, be detectives, be anthropologists, be out there discovering all these really deep insights into things, challenge your own assumptions. But step one is actually sort of getting in the door. So how did you get in the door? What did you find out? Which questions were effective and which ones maybe weren't in terms of generating the kind of insights we're looking for? So we'll go start in the front, and again, we'll just kind of like weave our way back.
All right. Should I be sharing something? Or
no, just talk over here. Just talk. Yeah.
The interviews and
the interviews. Yeah. Like how did you approach it? How did you get off the ground? What are you going to do differently going forward?
Yeah. So we're kind of in a spot where we're still trying to very much figure out not only our customers and what they do and where they are, but also what it is the customers want, which is going to be different depending on which customers we settle. So I think there's, you know, a meta level of discovery happening there as well. And some of it might depend on what ends up being, you know, easier or more readily apparent. We'll see. So to start with, I think, you know, I went out with reaching out to subject matter experts first. You know, these are the ones who are already very engaged with the technology and in the community, and you know, like I said, they're experts. They're developing it on their own, or they're consulting, or or actually building a product, you know, while they're doing that. So they're a really good technical resource, maybe not necessarily an eventual customer, but a really good place to start to figure out what problems and challenges might exist out there. So that was sort of the you know, the overarching kind of, here's where we're going to start.
And that can be a worthwhile thing. Who are the customers? And I was just talking about earlier, like how do you sequence them out, right? We can all look at any of the things that we've developed. We can say, okay, I can imagine however many different customers. But again, how to sequence them? You don't necessarily go largest first, right? Or whatever it happens to be. Were there any things in terms of actually reaching the customers that helped? Kind of non-obvious tips or tricks?
So again, in this industry, it tends to be that.
And remind us all again what general industry is. Give like
Right.
two
So
bullet
it's
points.
internet engineering, so data communications and new internet protocols, basically. And we're talking to basically people who are involved heavily in the SEOs, the standard development organizations, and actually working on not only implementing the protocol, but creating it. So train of thought was what
Worked that didn't work and got that.
right. So in this industry, as it's kind of been a recurring theme here with the class so far, is they don't really want to talk. We don't really want to talk in this industry, especially not face to face, really not
Even
over.
to the IOL.
Yeah,
I feel like a little bit of a foot in the door.
that
Yeah,
helps.
for sure.
I reached out to a handful of contacts I found basically looking through the protocols, and 3 have come back to me so far. I've actually already had one phone conversation, which was good. He was actually very willing, right? Very back, like, let's talk this afternoon. He did his research, looked this up. So I think actually in that case, it was tremendously beneficial that I had the IOL backing me, and the fact that this program is happening. So it was a good conversation. Very willing to chat, and overarching gave us good information and cautioned us about only dipping our toe in the water. Is a good quote. Only dipping our toe in the water. He said, "You really want to go waist deep right now. It's too complicated to not."
Yeah,
jump
interesting.
right in.
Yeah.
So when you're contacting something, is there any concern about this being a phishing thing or in some way, you know, given all the paranoia around IT these days and all that, are there, you know, flags that somehow, you know, you encounter, and are there ways to?
I mean, I'm sure there'll be no way for me to know, except unless somebody emails back and says, "Hey, I didn't get this because it was in my, spam folder." I have no doubt that by the time we're done, somebody will say that to me. I suspect nobody that happens. I mean, most things, and who knows, but not using mail services and actually using a real personal email account, and a lot of these people too, if you use encryption and things like that, they really get a kick out of that.
Yeah.
Not using links, not using too many fancy things like pictures and things like that in emails will also be a good way to avoid spam. Any complicated, images, Twitter icons, Facebook icons that can link out can sometimes, flag it poorly. So I haven't run into that yet, but sure, I mean, that's
I just remember I went through IT training with my former employer and how to identify spam and phishing and all that. And then you'd get emails from the CFO that weren't really from the CFO and things like that, so.
And I mean,
the other thing to remember too is that sometimes a multi-channel approach can work, right? I mean, again, you go to a meetup, you go to a trade show, you exchange business cards. It sounds a little old-fashioned, but sometimes that can actually be much more effective,
that's
as well
what
as email and phone calls and on
That's
down
what
the
I was
line. Yeah.
thinking, actually, snail mail might be more credible than an email these days, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's throw everything at it. I mean, understand your industry and know what's not working, right? I mean, don't just send 27 emails and say, sorry, I couldn't get an interview, right? You show a little bit more hustle, a little bit more ingenuity than that. And again, that's what I was kind of recommending also, starting with people in your existing network, right? I mean, having, working at the IOL, I'm sure you have a lot of people in your network, former students, somebody you could reach out to, former employees, to say, okay, and also that's a really good sort of like soft landing audience, because they'll probably still like you even if you screw up your script or something. So there's kind of a couple of reasons why that approach works.
That's the other good thing about this group of people that I chose to contact first, is they are excited about the protocol. It's their baby. It's what they've been working on. So they're happy to talk about it.
I was going for the example with the fish test as well. They actually didn't have a lot of trouble getting people to want to engage with that, right? I mean, from chefs to reputable seafood distributors, everyone, people are like, yeah, I want to know what I'm eating and all of that, right? And so it actually was easier, I think, than they thought, once they kind of had the right people to approach and the right way to approach and say, yeah, like if you have a solution to this, I'm at least willing to hear you out. All right, let's go for Main Street Academy next.
So Main Street Academy, our idea is a training program to keep and bring vibrancy to downtowns or Main Street. So we did our interviews. They were great. Can't wait to do more. We went with some folks that we already knew, given the time frame, thinking they would do this quickly with us. And we also are thinking a lot about all our customer segments. And so we were deliberate about interviewing a state funder, someone from the federal program, an academic, Department of Extension, and a national nonprofit, because those are sort of the segments we're looking
good
at.
breadth. Yeah.
And wanted to be comfortable with our questions. And so far we found, I know what Casey jump into if she wants. We've already got some themes just out of 5, which leads us to think there's 2 key things we're not asking, and we've been weaving that into the discussion. And I think we're in conversation about, should we just change a couple of questions?
Yeah, that's good reflection. Again, I haven't yet seen a team that just comes out and just nails every question across the board, right?
We didn't expect to, so I don't think. Okay, yeah, so.
And you found people are pretty receptive, though? I mean, within your own network to sort of,
Yes, but also curious, why are you asking? What are you doing?
Yeah.
Is this for research? And without even asking, saying, oh, here's some names. Can I make some intros? You got to talk to these other folks.
Yeah.
And also, which we expected, but it came out pretty quickly, perceived competitor in the market, and folks reference that, and where we're with that and whatnot. So
yeah, good stuff to know. And again, we're trying to strike that balance between, sometimes if you go in so broad and you're just like, tell me about your business. And he's like, what? I'm busy doing my business, so I can't tell you all about my business. But I think if you go in too narrow and be like, well, are you looking for a new solution for this tiny little thing? So kind of striking that middle ground, again, where we're saying, well, how do you think about these things? How do you approach these things? When you make a change, what does it look like, right? Those are the kind of questions, again, that are not yes or no questions, and that really can get somebody kind of talking and thinking. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So I think we're getting to the sort of value piece of it. What we don't think we were getting to is, are people going to be willing to pay?
Yeah.
And so I know we're not supposed to talk about our idea or do a pitch or sales, but can we craft a question that fleshes out?
It's interesting. I would encourage you to continue to understand exactly how much value you create and why. If you start thinking about a pricing question, the way to think about it, if you want to ask that, is thinking about the price of the status quo. And that gives you kind of an idea of how to position what you're doing. But again, as soon as you start talking dollars and cents, a lot of people tend to clam up. It might be different if you're talking to municipalities, where some of the stuff might be public, possibly because of public contracting and other things. Again, I don't know the details of it, but
It's an amount, it's more the idea, will you pay it all?
Will you pay it all? Yeah. Well, what's interesting, again, thinking about how the problem is currently being solved. If there is currently a solution, figure out what it is, the competitor, and then actually go and see if you can price that out. And one of the ways that we did that for Take Shape is that we called up BodPod and we said we were thinking about buying one, because they didn't have their prices public. right? And so we actually knew how much our competitor's system was selling for. Now, if the default is that they're doing nothing, that's a little harder to try to kind of position against. But that's the way I would handle it, at least early on, because again, that willingness to pay is a little bit challenging. A couple years ago had an advertising platform, and the way they worked around it is they were advertising to a new way of advertising for ski resorts, basically, with like an on-mountain guide and all this integrated stuff on your phone. And they didn't say how much were you be willing to pay for this, but they actually had the marketing directors at the ski areas would share with them how much they were spending in general on marketing and across different categories. So then you can start to think, okay, if they're spending $400,000 on sort of outbound marketing a year, you can start thinking about where you could be in terms of getting a slice of that. You're not going to get the whole thing, right? But it just gives you kind of an order of magnitude. But again, if the current system is costing zero, you might have to get more creative and think about what it's costing in terms of maybe labor or maybe missed opportunity or some of these other kind of things. Yeah. And again, it gets them talking about what they're actually doing. So not what I would like to do at some point in the future, but this is what I'm actually doing today, and this is my current solution.
Well, like a nice to have versus need to have, right?
Exactly.
You could get that out, because if they say, well, it'd be nice to have, well, would you pay for it? No.
Exactly.
Then it's not a true need, right?
Exactly. And if they're currently paying for something that's similar, it gives you some evidence that they have a willingness to pay. Which is sort of kind of a good benchmark, even if you don't want to ask directly. I think eventually that question is actually incredibly important, but that almost ends up being a little bit at the end of the funnel once we really decide who the customer is, how we're providing value, how if we can switch things around to provide even more value or cut our own costs. Once we go through those machinations, then at the end of it, you'll have a much better sense probably of how much value you're creating and how much value you can capture.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to mentor funnel.
So just to kind of remind everybody what we're doing, or we're trying to do at least, is we're trying to create a platform to match and connect people to their ideal mentors based on personality types, skill sets, goals, and then providing that platform to facilitate the connection and really focus on the development of that relationship. Now, for us, this first week was kind of like you had a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and you just threw it all over the table, and you got to kind of figure that out from there. But we definitely learned a lot, not only about how we go about talking to people and making those first connections, but also about what types of questions we want to ask and what types of information we're really looking to know about. So for starters, we started out by talking to friendly first connections, so family, friends, but we also did do a couple of cold connections through we're sitting at coffee shops, overhearing a few people talking about business or something like that. Just sat down with them, tried to ask them a couple of different questions and set up a few different meetings as well. Through that, we were able to learn a little bit about where our customers' minds are at in terms of mentoring right now and how they go about seeking that, and really what value they see behind mentorships, which we actually found out that a lot of people who haven't had mentorship experience as of now really aren't looking for it. But the people who have had mentorship experience, they may not be looking for it, but they know the value behind it, and they praise that value, if that makes sense. So now what we're looking to figure out is how we can find those people who already have those mentorship experiences and really dig deep into not only what they loved about the mentorship that they were in, or conversely what they didn't like about it, but also how we can improve that experience. So now we're kind of reconfiguring our questions, making it a little bit more open to people who already have had those mentorships rather than trying to get that pull that information from people who don't have that experience yet.
Because the implicit sort of assumption that you were working on is that everybody wants mentoring.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody wants mentoring. We just need to help them find that. And you're figuring out not everybody does, right? Yeah. And again, there's people that might want mentoring but don't know how to find it, and that's going to be a different group than the people who have had ongoing mentoring experience but now need mentoring in a different area, right? So that's really in terms of really slicing down who your at least your initial set of customers are. That's a really good insight to have. And again, when we have these ideas, like we're trying to promote mentoring. So mentoring is good. So let's have mentoring for everybody. That's such a natural impulse that, again, just going through a couple of these early checks, I think is really going to help narrow that funnel for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tracy, my partner, has also had some input on that as well, and finding exactly what you just said.
Yeah. And they're great things to discover, right? Because you can imagine building a product or a platform or a piece of software for that market that doesn't value it if you kind of just ran with those assumptions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really good. So we'll go back to thermonuclear diesel, which is awesome. I mean, it sounds like a metal band in the 80s. I love it.
So to remind people, I have a patent pending on a new approach to nuclear fusion. So customers and all of this is a very vague proposition at this point.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to know if it's going to work. Probably won't, but it's too important not to try.
Yeah.
Since much of the reason people are interested in fusion is environmental and sustainability and going for the low hanging. I've talked to some people involved in sustainability, which is not hard to do on the UNH campus. And there were some interesting aspects. I sort of asked about potential future power systems, and all of them immediately got down in the weeds about energy storage rather than energy production. Only one of them mentioned fusion. That was at the end of his comments, and it was sort of a throwaway thing. But of course, if we had fusion, this whole problem would go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was interesting. I made a point of not telling them what I was working on.
Yeah.
Obviously, I said, I'll tell you at the end. One of the questions I had was whether something that had a finite source of fuel would be viewed in a negative fashion. So the way I phrased the question is, if you had something that had a finite amount of fuel, how long would it have to power civilization to be considered sustainable? And then I started with the example, okay, if it lasts 5 billion years, Earth is going to be gone because the sun's going to be a red giant. So I assume that's acceptable, but what shorter period?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm an astrophysicist.
No. It's yeah.
So that was interesting because it ranged from centuries to 10,000 years. 1,000 years was pretty much the median, which happens to be how long we think lithium supplies can easily last to power civilization and get nuclear fusion. So that was reassuring.
Yeah. One of the biases I was just reading on, which is interesting, is that humans are famously bad at like the middle term. That basically, like if I ask you about electrical cars, if I say in 10 years will all of our cars be electric, most people will say no. Say 100 years they'll all be electric, almost everybody will say yes, or we won't have cars, right? If I say 50 maybe, but if we get in that like 10 to 50 year range, we're actually in organizations who are famously bad at getting that wrong. We know eventually where we'll be. We know where we'll be in the near term, but that middle term is just a black hole imagination.
So when I told him what I was working on, the reaction was sort of a version of what I've been telling my students for a long time, which is nuclear fusion has been 30 to 40 years away for the last 7.
Yes. Yeah.
But it could be done. It could be done quickly enough. It would be wonderful. So.
Yeah, and admittedly, it's a little bit of a tricky situation because we were thinking about going out and talking to customers, and I realized you're going to have a very limited number of end customers, and so I appreciate the challenge. But the insight you had, even that there's sort of storage advocates and then there's production advocates, like I think even that sort of fork in the road is probably a pretty useful thing to have early on, right? Because you're going to be focused, I imagine, on the ecosystem in general that's interested in production. Yeah.
I had a small suggestion for the people who are in the production side, going like to the entities that they go to for credibility. So utilities, electric utilities will go to the EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. If they go, the utilities don't have people on board who think about technology at this point there, but somewhere in the industry, there are entities like that. So those are the ones to figure out, who actually is sort of the industry R&D or industry, promoter. EPRI came to mind immediately when you talked about production, say.
And Another thing that it would be interesting to do is talk to the people who are thinking about putting in a new power plant, and why they hate or don't hate coal, what drives them in terms of combined cycle natural gas. We basically baseline power system and fission.
Yeah.
Everyone calls it nuclear. Might be a possibility. What are the pros? What are the cons?
Yeah. Even that thing about like how do we think about what's really sustainable as a fuel source? With billions or thousands or hundreds of years, I feel like what sort of qualifies for that might be is it probably a good process.
I think you have a lot of other people to talk to. What about safety? Will your neighbors allow you to put in a fusion plant someplace? There's going to be various kinds of safety issues. Your investors in your power plants certainly have a sunk investment in current technology. Are they going to let that go very easily? There's a whole lot of associated people politically, safety-wise, and other ways as you start thinking about the broader impact of this. I think you probably need to interview all of them, not just what you call customers.
Whether or not even the public can keep fusion and fission straight and
Well, I think you hit it when you said people have been burned now because fusion has been 20 years off for most of my life. And I think there's people have been burned by nuclear, which was going to be too cheap to meter, nuclear fission. So actually figuring out who's out there who's going to say something and what it would take to sort of persuade them.
And I think we're gonna have to
We'll
move along after this point. Go ahead.
That's why I wanted to talk to the sustainability people, because they are the people others listen to. They're the people who push back oftentimes, but less so now, against fission.
And congratulations to this team for being like in the deepest into the pool of any I-Core team I think that I've ever worked with, just in terms of doing something that's really challenging to identify a core set of customers you've gone to the interview, that you've taken on an incredible challenge, I think, in that space, and I'm excited to see how it evolves. All right, down to, which team is this here? Reusable electrochemical sensor for hydrophobic analytes.
Working on the.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. So general background, we're basically our product is a reusable sensor for applications in medical devices and bioprocessing. So this last week really focused, like a lot of people, on kind of investigating and refining our customer base. So Jeff and I had kind of different mediums of finding those customers. What I found that really worked for me was taking who I knew. So, the companies that I kind of targeted were more of the expert matter companies, those who are actually manufacturing sensors and medical devices. And what I found was, while their actual sensor might not have been applicable or in the same context as what we're hoping to do, it gave me a lot of insight on kind of the general qualities that, an actual company looks for in a sensor design, which I found very helpful. And also, it was really helpful because using who I knew, I worked with a company who made sensors this summer, and so I used kind of my contact there, and from that contact stemmed 3 more contacts, someone from actual manufacturing, someone from quality control, and someone from customer services. So it's kind of like a package deal where I get to see the whole process of a sensor, from the development of the sensor to actually getting it to your customer.
And any one of those could possibly either block or help the introduction of your product, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, they all
the different perspectives.
They play together very well. And I noticed that it was also using contacts that you already had. It was kind of established that credibility, like they were willing to talk to me because they valued the person who I was kind of going through. One of the things that I found the most difficult was actually getting sidetracked in conversation. So I talked to a company who has just an unbelievable medical device technology, and I had a hard time staying on point because I wanted to learn more about what they were doing. So I kept having to go back and say, we'll talk about this later, but I want to learn more about what, this device. And, that part was definitely difficult. And then I think the other part that I learned was actually scheduling interviews is a little bit difficult because, when your schedules don't match, you're like, oh, let's shoot for this time. And then that time comes around, they're like, oh, I can't, can we push it off? And so I struggled with that a little bit, but.
getting out ahead of it with scheduling is obviously important. And we kind of go back and forth between we want you to do interviews every week, but we also realize a week's not a big time frame in terms of getting on people's calendars. And then everybody here is also doing other stuff. So that challenge is very real. Where do you think you're going to go from here in terms of new and interesting or different customers? It seems like you've focused in on this one customer group. Are you going to segment within that group? Are you going to look for kind of adjacent spaces where there might be, quicker adoption or something like that?
I think both. So I want to learn more about how sensors are actually designed, but some of his conversations led us to kind of a new customer base that we might want to look into, which is the bioprocessing, and kind of realizing that instead of point of care, which might not have as much value, or at least our sensor wouldn't have as much value. Now we understand, well, here's this other, kind of field where they're like, hey, this is a big deal for us. This could change how our day works. So
that's an awesome observation, because I was actually going to ask you about that when you threw out those two markets really quick at the beginning, right? The processing and the product market. Again, when you dive in, you might find that it's much more applicable in one than the other, or alternatively, just maybe one is actually more open to new and interesting ideas than the other. And again, the details of the field, better than I. But again, when you really dive in, it's amazing what you can uncover, even if you think the markets are closely related, or originally you think one might make more sense than the others. It's an initial market.
And with that being said, I don't want to cut them off yet, because there's a lot of value in negative feedback, which is, I forget which book, but I think that's going to be really helpful in understanding, well, why don't you, why isn't this valuable to you? Just to kind of get a better sense of,
And if you're ever pitching investors, as a former CFO, I can tell you, basically saying, this is what we didn't do and why we didn't do it is an incredibly important answer to have in your back pocket. It's not like, oh, we didn't think about it or we assumed. So, we really looked into that. On the surface, I know it looks great, but here's why it doesn't make sense for us to have this time. Really powerful thing to have, for sure. Do you want to add it all? Or? Okay, sounds good. We'll move to which group here? Oh, okay, new tools for STEM recruitment. All right.
So basically the concept that we're working on is recruiting graduate students into STEM graduate programs. And it was really interesting to me. I've got a lot of experience and perspective from the biological and molecular biology sort of arena, that I talked to some engineering people, which was interesting, and just learning how different programs work, how they value different metrics for evaluating their graduate students and prospective students, and what success in those programs looks like. And I also am developing some questions to talk to people that have just recently got into graduate school and figuring out what that process looks like on their end and how to help that. And after I get a little bit more background, I like to actually keep talking to those groups, but to talk to actually the graduate school administrative type structures after I get a feel for what those two groups are.
And group, I'm not sure if you said that you talked to them, but another kind of going on what we were talking about earlier, it's interesting, is talking to people who decided not to go to graduate school, right? And why? And not the people who just didn't make the cut in terms of sort of skills or something, but why maybe there's somebody who's a successful bench scientist somewhere that gets certifications and not go back to grad school, or whatever the situation is. Always talking to sort of and trying to understand who's not the customer and why.
One of the people I interviewed actually talked about how their applicant numbers were down for graduate schools, even for master's programs, and they think that is because they have so many job opportunities right now that they are opting not to even apply. So that is interesting.
Yeah, definitely, right? And again, you might want it to be otherwise, but it's just a really important thing to uncover. So what are you going to do kind of going forward for additional interviews? You mentioned a couple, but are you going to kind of expand out, narrow down?
Expand out. So this round I talked mostly to people that were like graduate program coordinators that kind of work with admissions, maybe for a department's 3 or 4 graduate programs as opposed to just one program. And they actually had some interesting ideas of who else I should talk to and who else I should talk to at their institution in the graduate school.
Yeah.
And So.
And that'll be part of sort of sorting through the university org chart to figure out who the customer is.
And
We had a conversation earlier too, that sometimes there's a gatekeeper and a user and a decision maker and a check writer, and that process can be.
yeah, so but in the next round of issues, I think I want to try to find some keys and then work on questions.
Yeah.
from a higher level.
From both sides, right? Really.
Yeah,
thinking-
and then just keep expanding those.
And good questions in that environment, right, are like saying, okay, when you do, acquire, implement a new tool for students in general, like how do you find out about it? How do you think about it, right? I mean, all of those kind of things can be really useful. Kind of where does it plug into the universe of other things that we're doing?
And that's what I was hoping that when I start talking to students and say, how did you find your school? What were your criteria for looking at that?
Exactly, and that's a great open-minded question, because we might have assumptions buried on why we chose the graduate schools we did, or why kids these days choose the graduate schools they do or don't. Like all these things are assumptions that we all have, and going out there and actually really testing those can lead to really good insights. And again, if it's exactly what you expected, now you actually have some data to back that up, right? Yeah.
I was just going to say the conventional wisdom of graduate school enrollees and applications is typically that in economic expansions, when the employment is amiable, less people apply because the opportunity cost of them doing so is too great. So you would, timing-wise, actually be at a pretty interesting inflection year of launching this, because you may very well get two sides of the data right as you're getting off the ground, which would be certainly a valuable piece of information to have.
All right, for sake of time, we're going to go ahead and move along to Ambrosia Fabrics.
Ambrosia Fabrics. So quick background, we are developing a new line of upholstery fabrics, sustainable upholstery fabrics made of hemp and bamboo, and mostly going to be selling straight to the manufacturers, or at least hope to sell straight to the manufacturers. And I actually sold furniture for about a year and a half, so I just started with people in my network, just people that work for these companies that I hope to eventually sell to, that are basically just reps that I used to work with when I sold their furniture on the showroom floor, and just reached out to them and said, hey, what are you guys doing about sustainability? Are you looking towards this? Is this something that's even on the radar? And they gave me some good feedback, which I was kind of expecting, because I sold on the showroom floor. I kind of had an idea of what I think they might say, and it was basically that, yes, we are focusing on sustainability, but the biggest push right now, especially in the fabrics, is, how's it going to hold up to my kids? How's it going to hold up to my dog? What happens if somebody comes over and, I host a party and, they spill Kool-Aid on it or whatever? How is it going to clean? How's it going to wear? And that was probably the biggest, issue that they raise is, if it's sustainable, fantastic, but, if it can't clean, if it can't perform, you're probably not going to have a shot, at least right now, because at this point in the market, that's 9 out of 10 times that's the first question out of people's mouths is, okay, I don't want leather, but the fabric, how is it going to hold up? How's it going to clean?
And then part of what you're probably going to end up needing to do is also go across segments, right? Because when we say people buying furniture, that's a big range, right? And again, it's sort of a fairly non-millennial. I love all these things come out there like, oh, millennials are actually buying houses, moving to the suburbs and doing whatever, right? Because there's a long list for a decade of millennials killing every industry, including furniture. Right. But again, and don't make it just a demographic thing, make it a behavioral thing, because if your fabric performs almost as well in those other things, but is incredible in terms of sustainability, maybe you're not going to sell to Lazy Boy or some kind of mainstream furniture manufacturer, but there might be some kind of specialized, right? Specialized group of ones that differentiate through sustainability primarily that might be interested. Again, you know the industry better than I do, but again, see if you can really start to slice up that market and not just talk about all furniture sales and what people want, but really start to narrow down on who might be a good initial market. Yeah.
A great case study on that is a company called Naturepedic,
Mhm.
which generates baby mattresses, and they try to get into the adult mattress they actually realized that was a horrible business venture. They wasted a lot of money doing that. And they're still in fact they know the baby mattress.
Yeah, and it's interesting. My kids are a few years old, so I haven't bought a baby mattress in a little while. But I mean, we've thought a lot about it. We bought 2 new mattresses, and one was like made out of coconut fibers and bamboo. I mean, I would never have done that for myself, which is probably a commentary on parenthood, right? But for my kids, it was like I couldn't order that thing fast enough. And again, that's not as big of a market as all mattresses, but it gives you that entry point possibly, right? So again, kind of really keep asking around. And it sounds like with your industry contacts, you might be able to focus down that group.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, I talked to a couple of retailers also just to get their thoughts.
Yeah.
And one guy said, oh, you should go to that organic mattress store in Portsmouth, which is a great idea because I got to speak with him and he goes, we get calls, you know, because they have a store in Portsmouth and New York,
Yeah.
but most of these calls go to the New York store. He goes, people are looking for the organic furniture, but it's like, you know, they're kind of a niche store.
Yeah.
You know, in a sense.
Yeah, for sure. And a niche is very much not bad when you're a startup. Right. I mean, you probably won't have the kind of capital needed to really go after like an entire market. So thinking about that niche can get you up and get you going can be really good. All right, let's keep moving around. I realize we're a little low on time, so yeah.
My time, right? Okay. My story is need some background. So first is, have you guys heard about them? For example, if a criminal rapist, right? Some guy have strong sexual impulse. So this guy have genetic things. They like to rape a woman or do some bad things, right? So there is a tendency. So okay, this rapist, okay, they have sexual impulse and then they did it because of the body. And then we put it in the jail and it help. But after they come out of the jail, they will do the things again. How to treat this? So there is some ideas to treat the criminal with hormone things. Give the hormone to the criminal and then make it they are less sexually impulsive. So this is the one treatment. So this is, you know, this idea, right? This is I think it's implementing to help the criminal. The criminal will not intend to have the rape behavior. So this is the kind of idea. My concept is similar to this idea, but it's not treating the criminal, but it's treating patient. The patient is autism patient. So we know the patient, the autism is, happened in boy much more than girl. We know that is, right? 4 boys, 1 girl. So we know it very well. So 4 boys is very high frequency. 4 boys and 1 girl. So and recently we have one study that shows that the male and the female and the gene is same. About the same. We know that, but the difference is the protein regulation is different.
Okay, so I think you're getting a little bit down the weeds. I like the elevator pitch part. I think it's good.
Yeah.
But who have you talked to and how did that work?
Have to first let the idea convey clearly, and then I will talk with parents and doctors and scientists. So the idea is to if a boy have autism, and we can make the boy a little bit like a girl. So make it become a girl, and the girl will not like have autism. So I want to talk with the parents. Okay, would you accept this treatment if your kid is an autistic boy, and then would you like to something that hormone treatment make it become a girl?
How are you gonna find those parents? Remember, we kind of had that conversation last time that it's a delicate subject. It's about health. It's about kids. So where do you think you're going to find those potential customers, whether they be the physicians, the therapists, or the parents, to give them this elevator pitch, if that's the elevator pitch you're
This is good to find out. I have to contact the community, the autistic community.
Okay.
There is a strong association or association. They have parents, and then actually there is a association. Out of the parents have the association. I can contact them. And some people will help me connect the parents, and I will connect the parents, the doctors. And I think this is the concept. And I have to talk with different scientists to let them evaluate whether this idea worked or not.
And I would say kind of generally too, I mean, things like trade organizations or nonprofit advocacy groups can actually be a good place to go. Sometimes they're actually trying to make these kind of connections, right? So my fault for mismanaging time a little bit, but I want to make sure everybody has a chance to add some value. So let's keep coming on around with Sapient Capital Partners.
Yeah, so we're trying to basically look at an alternative to debt for higher ed finance. That's a 35,000 foot view here. And as Andrew and I talked about briefly at the front, we have like 3 main core segments of our client base. We've got the actual investors who are looking to provide capital to students to help them fund their educational expenses. Then you've got the institutions, which in our case, being Andrew, clarified that he thought they would be likely a gatekeeper who would be providing access to the end user, which is eventually the student, right? And so in order for this to work, the capital has to be there first. So the investors are kind of the customer of first importance, and then that transcends on from there as time goes on, which conveniently, the people that I've spoken to so far are primarily investors. On the positive side, I've gotten a lot of good feedback about this is something that structurally and from an implementation standpoint they could see working and that they see as investable if it were to pan out in that way. On the negative side, there's a lot of data and there's a lot of research and there's a whole lot of construction of models to back this up and back testing that needs to happen to understand if a portfolio consists of agreements from this populace, how does this perform in 08, how does this perform in 2001, how does this perform in et cetera. And so,
adverse selection problems and other things that are making those kind of marks.
so those sorts of issues and trying to parse out how that plays out, both in the modeled scenario, back tested, and then also with respect to the adverse selection, because that's a big challenge that's going to come up with respect to the students that would be more likely to sign up for this sort of a program. If you've got a student who's going to Harvard College and majoring in economics and wants to go work at an investment bank, he is far less likely to see this as a value add to him than someone who's going to UNH and studying English, because he sees his future earnings as being so vast and massive that this could in no way, shape, or form help him, and tying his payments to his earnings would be a net loss for his balance sheet.
And so the bigger question, really, what you're going to be asking is, if you're going to go to these investors, the question is, how do you decide what to invest in? Really, and how do you decide if somebody offers you a new investment vehicle? What do you have to be able to show for them even to consider it, right? And so before we get into collateralizing debt and selecting schools and majors and all this kind of stuff, you're asking more about that fundamental process. And I know you've been doing it, but again, just to sort of a broader lesson for the whole group, it's really about, okay,
how do you make a decision?
Again, you have this new exotic investment tied to these other things. Again, how do you say, yeah, I want to take a risk on that coming from some company I've never heard of? How can I assure this isn't, uninhabited ranch homes in Stockton, California in 2007? So, well, let's move on to the last group here. Yes.
So we're actually working on innovation, and we want to focus on innovation in rural areas, both social innovation and small businesses. So we do some catching up on the interviews, missed last week.
Yeah.
So, but have our interview questions, have a good list of people to work at, to reach out to, both businesses and entrepreneurs, partners, and
how did you generate that list? Like what?
So mostly people I just know of.
Yeah.
We know of. So part of it is tailoring and scaling up existing stuff, and designing and implementing new programming. So a lot of it is people who are coming to existing programming, what are they looking for?
Yeah. And that's a really interesting split, right? There's so much emphasis on we need a new startup ecosystem for X, Y, or Z, but then there's another set of customers, which is there's a lot of existing companies that may want to innovate in new and interesting ways, including creating social value as well as economic value, right? So I think really figuring out which of those groups you're talking to or focusing on and can add the most value, I think is going to be sort of step one of that fork in the road.
Yeah, I think was the realization today, reading the book, was I think it said, like, you can't be all things to all people.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's totally common, right? And again, you could think about narrowing the scope is a good way to think about it. Think about different market segments, and then we talked about a few times, really think about sequencing. You may want to do it all, but you can actually do it in a sequence that makes sense and then builds on itself and builds on the credibility from earlier segments. Can be a really effective way to do that. And like everything else in here, be intentional about it, grounded in real observations and interviews, and you'll be able to kind of make it into a coherent whole. So that's all I have for today. I was going to mention keep practicing the mom test, but I think everybody's good to go on that. So thanks for a great session. Thanks for staying here until the end, listening to one another, and then do another 5 interviews for next week. So here's the mom test, 5 interviews. Again, really think about this idea of either broadening out or narrowing down, depending on what you consider, and really focus on that value proposition. So why the group?
I think I know what it is. But I
Yeah.